Hey guys, this is Eckhart Slaughter. Hello and welcome to another video. Today we'll be talking about support ships of the Empire with a focus on one of my favorites, the Modular Task Force Cruiser. Before we begin, however, today's video is brought to you by Audible. As you guys know, this is one of my favorite services. I've got months of Audible time because I love audiobooks, and in my opinion, Audible is the best audiobook service. Audible has always offered an incredible selection of audiobooks across every genre, but now you'll also, with your membership, discover exclusive Audible originals from a ton of different names that you probably know. As an Audible member, you get one title a month to keep from their entire catalog, including new bestsellers, alongside an unlimited amount of audiobooks, Audible originals, and podcasts, with more being added each month. On the Audible app, you can listen everywhere. As I said, my favorite place is in the car. Looking for a recommendation? My go-to when people ask is always the original Thrawn trilogy. Make sure you get the unabridged version. Want to change it up? Well, the Halo audiobooks are a lot of fun, or you can go way different and check out the amazing Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer. New members can try Audible free for 30 days at audible.com/EckhartSlaughter or by texting EckhartSlaughter to 500-500. Alright, so the Modular Task Force Cruiser, the MTFC, was one of many ships created in the Dark Empire comics. However, while it would appear many times in comic form, it would get its name and most of its background information in the Dark Empire sourcebook. Since then, unfortunately, it's not really appeared in other media, even in Star Wars Legends, which I think is a shame because it's a really smart and interesting vessel. So, as explained in the sourcebook, the idea for the Modular Task Force Cruiser was that the Imperial Navy was massive and had a lot of varied needs. Obviously, you've got dreadnoughts, battle cruisers, and of course Star Destroyers for fighting. That's really only a small part of what a galaxy-spanning navy would be required to do. That being said, all of these different support ships were both expensive and logistically at least overwhelming, especially when they were competing with warships for shipbuilding berths. This is what would lead to the design of the Modular Task Force Cruiser, and as a note, it's actually quite similar to what we've seen in other support and service vessels in the Empire, which we'll get to later. So, according to the Dark Empire sourcebook, and this is a quote, following a report on streamlining fleet operations, a new approach was urged, and from proposals, TAG Industries won the contract and construction began in earnest. The result was the Modular Task Force Cruiser. So, moving off quote now, the Empire basically realized that a lot of these support and service vessels really were quite similar on a fundamental level. So, what they did to streamline shipbuilding and production was create a space frame, the Modular Task Force Cruiser, and you're probably starting to see where the name comes from. In its default form, the ship didn't do a whole lot of anything. It was essentially just a skeleton. However, it could then take on certain modules to act in a specialized role. And the great thing is, these modules could be interchanged. So if you have no longer need for a hospital ship, you can transform it and do something else entirely without having to build a completely new vessel. And this really was interchangeable and customizable. The ship derived its purpose and its specialty from what was known as Mission Function Modules, MFMs. You can imagine these like cargo containers. They would literally be loaded onto the ship, attached to the ship's power and life support systems, and they're pretty much good to go. The Dark Empire sourcebook gives us some common examples. There was the hospital module, which could take a crew of 225 doctors, 400 nurses, 1,500 emergency technicians, and 1,000 medical droids into any sort of situation needed. Could be used to treat wounded after a disaster or space battle, but could also be used in more technical situations, for example, in radiation leaks. The observation module was used for espionage and intelligence gathering, and in a way, this MFM actually shows the limitation of the Modular Task Force Cruiser. Because the MTFC isn't a true scout vessel, the observation module is pretty limited in how it can be used. Obviously, the ship doesn't have stealth, so rather than say a New Republic snoop, which would hide around in enemy territory, the Modular Task Force Cruiser was really limited to long-range reconnaissance. The rescue module was used mostly in the cleanup of space battles. It would often work in conjunction with hospital ships to repair damaged ships after space battles. It didn't substitute as a full repair yard. It was mostly just put a band-aid on a ship so it can get back to a space dock, but you can imagine how a fleet of these ships working together could be able to pull off some pretty impressive after-battle cleanups. The Survey MFM was used mostly for exploring and colonizing new worlds, and interestingly, by the time of Dark Empire, there was even a newly created Inquisition module, which was used to punish worlds which had harmed the Empire. It had everything from prefab bases, which could be slapped down on a planet's surface, to torture chambers, planetary bombs, and more. Additionally, the sourcebook contemplates other standard MFMs and notes that TAG Industries was working on making micro MFMs, so essentially a ship could be loaded up for multiple different mission types. I think it would have also been cool to see task force cruisers of different sizes. The standard task force cruiser is about 1.1 kilometers. I think it would have been cool to see ones of larger size meant to accommodate more modules. Not only so you can have, say, a hospital and repair ship, but so you can have a super hospital ship or a super survey ship, whatever. When it came to defenses, modular task force cruisers had some light weaponry, and many of the modules also had hangars with even some defense craft. However, traditionally, these would have been protected by other ships because they would have been a part of larger fleets. And I don't know, this ship makes a lot of sense to me, especially because you're able to sort of change the character of your fleet really quickly. But I also sort of question the practicality of that, because if you're going to be changing a ship, say from a rescue ship to a reconnaissance ship, that means you need to have that extra module lying around. And if it's just lying around, wouldn't it be better served on a ship? So really, maybe the modular task force cruiser makes sense more from a shipbuilding perspective, especially if you're making all the space frames in one place and can pump them out really quickly. Then rather than adapting individual fleets, you're sort of adapting shipbuilding to the needs of the Navy as a whole, and the changing of modules thing is sort of just a nice bonus. But yeah, I mentioned that there was another Imperial ship this reminded me of. I was thinking of the Field Secured Containment Vessel, which also had an initialism, the FSCV. Kind of like the Modular Task Force Cruiser, the FSCV was essentially a pair of engines. In between the engines, you could add a number of cargo modules. In the video, I talk about how they were often used for fuel transport, but really, you could transport anything. And they're sort of the same benefits. Obviously, the ship has its stock form, but then can be used in any number of roles for any amount of cargo. And obviously, there were many other modular ships in the Star Wars universe. The CIS Navy was pretty heavily modular. The Providence could be changed for different mission profiles. We also see Corellian ships are often meant to be modded on the aftermarket. However, when thinking about this ship, I'm also reminded of the New Class project. That was essentially a New Republic shipbuilding effort aimed at modernizing their fleet. What they did was pretty smart. They essentially had 4 or 5 different ship classes, which each had the same basic space frame, but were then built into specialized variants. The most famous version would be the Nebula and Endurance class Star Destroyers, which again, the same ship when it gets to the bones, but one is designed for carrying and the other for ship-to-ship combat. So it makes a lot of sense, at least on a hand-wavy level when talking about logistics and shipbuilding. So that's all for today. Hope you enjoyed this video. Is there any questions, anything you'd like to see me cover next? Let me know that and more down below.